Hi guys, Liam from Lanterna here, back with another IB geography video, and today we're going to be talking a little bit more about changing population. Some of the earlier videos, they were looking at kind of the key ideas, the foundations, the definitions, those key bits of theory that help us understand how a population might change. Today we're going to be talking about managing population change. As always on this slide, I've just got a list of some of those key points from the syllabus. We want to be looking at some of those policies that countries use to manage population change. And this video in particular will be looking at anti-natalist policies, particularly the case of the one-child policy in China. Anti-natalism, as we mentioned briefly in an earlier video, is trying to discourage families and women from having more children. Okay, there might be a risk of overpopulation, or there might be a very youthful population, and they might be wanting to kind of turn that tide. That's where an anti-natalist policy might be introduced. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about China and the one-child policy. But before we go into the kind of nitty-gritty, the details in terms of the consequences, I want to be kind of first setting that context. Why was it needed? Why was such a controversial, widespread policy used in the kind of late 70s and beyond? So let's have a little look. You might have heard of this before. This is the 1958 Great Leap Forward. Okay, so Mao Zedong, the leader of China, decided they needed to kind of restructure the economy, put a very high value in terms of labour. It was going to be a labour-driven economy from the late 50s onwards. The problem with that, okay, was that it encouraged a lot of families to increase their size. It pushed the total fertility rate to around 6, okay, in the 60s, and that actually helped lead to a massive famine in the early part of the decade. In 1962, there was a widespread famine. Millions of people died, a humongous tragedy for humanity. Okay, but that was possibly exacerbated by the fact that there was such a large number of young individuals in China during that period of time. Okay, so the government, they recognised that actually this couldn't happen. There was a risk of overpopulation. There was a risk of another famine, and they had to try and curtail that total fertility rate and bring it down. And in fact, before the one-child policy was introduced in '79, there was a decade-long two-child policy. That's something not a lot of people know, but it just showed that there was a real appetite to reduce that total fertility rate because it was having such a lot of consequences and catastrophes for the country at large. So in terms of how the kind of policy was enforced, it's actually quite interesting, and it worked on a Shao kind of focus. That was the slogan: later, longer, fewer. And if you guys can mention that in an essay, that's a really impressive thing to do. It's talking about later marriages, longer gaps between births, okay, so birth spacing, trying to show the value of that for families, leading to fewer births altogether. You get married later, you're likely to have less children. You space these births out a bit longer. Again, that reduces that total fertility rate, leads to fewer children, and less pressure on services, resources, etc. in China. And this was based on a reward penalty approach. What that means is there was obviously incentives for people to follow the one-child policy rule. Okay, so they might have been rewarded with pay rises, promotions versus kind of punishments if they didn't follow. So that's pay cuts, okay, block promotions, and maybe even fines. And some of those fines were of such a size they could actually cripple households. You also don't get access, of course, if you don't follow the one-child policy, to a lot of family benefits. And that included free education for the child, but also free medical care, not only for that one child, but the rest of the family as well. And this was supplemented by a lot of propaganda, which was, a lot of it was kind of trying to encourage families to be smaller based on this, again, economic benefits. So Shao Sheng, meaning fewer births, quickly richer, just showing that actually if you have less children, your own family resources don't need to be spread as wide. You can really benefit that child. They might get a better education, have a better life kind of chance. But this again had a darker side. So there was a lot of reports of intimidation, discrimination, and widespread corruption as well. That's in terms of forced abortions, abductions, okay, not even issuing birth certificates. Okay, all of these things, massively controversial. Human rights abuses have been reported as well. So there was also this darker side to things. Not only were they positively encouraging people to have less children, but they were also sometimes actually forcing that to be the case. And the granny police was an interesting force that was at play, particularly during the kind of peak of the introduction in terms of the one-child policy. These were older women in the community, who were tasked with kind of coercing young women to go to their abortion meetings, to go and collect their contraceptive pills in order to reduce the family size. Okay, they were just monitoring the situation to ensure that it was kind of enforced. And because that was community based, there was a great sense of guilt that actually pushed a lot of people to follow the policy when it was enacted. Let's look now at some of those positives and negatives. Okay, so what were the consequences, and how, if we were given a question, would we probably answer something on the one-child policy, on an anti-natalist policy that was prevalent in the last part of the 20th century, and actually was only relaxed in 2015. So some of those positive impacts, there were estimated 400 million fewer births. China right now, I think, is almost hit 1.4 billion. 400 million less people in a country is an unbelievable amount. So clearly the policy actually worked in terms of its absolute goals, which was to reduce the number of people that were going to be born into China over that period of time in which it was prevalent. Okay, people are wealthier. Okay, that's factually true, but is that because of the one-child policy? Again, that's some of the evaluative things we need to be thinking about. Women actually have better opportunities because they have less children to care for, perhaps, but also because they've got better healthcare now as a result of some of those actual violations. Okay, so sort of ironic, sort of maybe something we wouldn't expect, but because of the mistreatment of women in terms of the maternal healthcare side of things, there's been a great improvement. So maybe learning from the mistakes that were made in the policy has actually had some kind of long-standing, long-term positive benefits for some of the Chinese population. They've got a more educated population, of course that makes sense. Okay, if you have less children, you have smaller class sizes, that's only going to benefit a student, and it also means that they might be able to access high levels of education, university and beyond. And is that a link with the economic growth? We know the starting rates at which China grew in the late 90s and through the noughties up until this year, in fact. Is that economic growth, how much of that is due to this one-child policy, due to those spillover benefits in terms of education, wealth, and women in terms of the professional side of their lives? Negatively, of course, there are a number of things we can note. It was a highly controversial piece of public policy for a number of reasons. Firstly was this thing called the Little Emperor Syndrome. And I think this is a really interesting concept. It's the idea that actually, because these are only childs, and they have actually a lot of elders, a lot of people who are caring for them, who obviously love them, they get this spoilt part of their personality develop. And that's something that has been kind of colloquially recognised as this laziness, and that can only be kind of a negative thing socially for a country. There was also a massive gender imbalance, okay, owing to the fact that males were deemed more valuable during the time this policy was enacted. There is a massive 30 million excess in males in China at the moment. Again, that creates this like bachelor village mentality, and in fact there are some bachelor villages in the country. This is where young men who are trying to find a wife, they physically can't, so they live together in these bachelor villages, and that's due to the fact that during the one-child policy, men were obviously preferred. Okay, due to the fact that they could continue the family name, they had access to a lot more jobs in China. Of course, that's changed as things have moved on, but in that period of time, families much preferred to have a boy rather than a girl. There's also this 1-2-4 situation. That's whereby, okay, although that child has a lot of support, they are going to be having to support those elders as they get older. We mentioned it in a few earlier videos, the idea of older dependence. Well, this one individual, okay, is going to have to provide for those old elders. Okay, not just in terms of tax revenue, but also with their time, with their effort, with their own money. So that's a really big issue that hasn't really been explored too much, and we're going to see the consequences of that over the next few decades. And there's obviously an impact on the economy. Okay, that's what I was meaning in terms of the pensions, in terms of the greater aging. So as soon as you move from that youthful population, there's a fine balance before you get into an elderly aging population, and that might be something China is going to have some issues with over the next few years and decades. And of course, one of the main ones, potentially the worst thing about the one-child policy, was the loss of human rights that a lot of women and families experienced as a result of the kind of stringent measures that the policy operated upon. And that's, of course, included in terms of the unregistered children. If you're unregistered, very, very hard for you to find a job, get a passport, leave the country, get any public benefits at all. So if we're weighing up these two sides, I'm not here, I don't have to tell you. You know, you guys are obviously can make your own mind up. For me, if I'm trying to evaluate this, I'd be thinking along kind of two lines. First and foremost, okay, what was good about it? Okay, what was kind of not good about it, but what were the kind of main drawbacks from the policy? Okay, so well, it did work, okay, but it did put people under a lot of mental and physical strain. That's what I was talking about when I mentioned the human rights abuses. However, despite those abuses, okay, it has kind of done what it set out to do. So it slowed population growth. There hasn't been another famine since. It can feed, the country can feed itself, and it's more sustainable. Okay, so this overpopulation issue, okay, although there are claims that it's still an overpopulated space, particularly in some of these urban spaces, it has been able to avoid the situation where it cannot provide for its own people. So that can only be a good thing. Okay, but whether that's more important, okay, than the actual individual quality of lives that people have or had during the one-child policy is up to you guys to argue. But it is testament to the policy that it was relaxed in 2013. In fact, in 2015, it became the two-child policy again. So there was a reverse. Okay, they recognised that actually the growth rate had slowed to such an extent that they were going to relax it a little bit. Okay, so that's just an overview about the anti-natalist policy in China. I hope you guys took a lot of value from this. And by all means, join me in a second for the second part of this particular topic. We're going to be talking about pronatalism.